Hello, microeconomists. Mr. Olson here. Let's do some econ. This is micro topic 6.2, externalities. Externalities are third-person side effects. So if they are called externalities because they're external benefits or external costs enjoyed or incurred by people outside of that market. Okay. When they're externalities, the market's failing because all the supply and demand analysis we've done included costs and benefits to the people who are voluntarily entering that transaction. And if there's an externality, then people outside of that market have costs that they're paying or benefits that they're enjoying, and that's not accounted for by the free market. A classic example of this is smoking cigarettes. And the free market's going to assume that the costs of cigarettes are paid fully by the people who decide to smoke. Of course, this isn't the case. There are many external social costs to smoking, such as secondhand smoke. So what we can do with our analysis is show why the market's failing in the example of smoking cigarettes, and we can actually create some policy to correct that market failure. This slide shows 4 images of kind of classic external negative externalities, which are external costs paid by people who are not voluntarily entering that market. So negative externalities are external costs. They are spillover costs that other members of society are paying that are not participating in that market. Okay, another classic example of this is pollution. If a chemical company is polluting the air, when they're looking at their cost of production and they're analyzing their total cost and their fixed costs and their variable costs, they're only looking at their internal costs. So they're not going to account for pollution when they're figuring out their profit maximizing quantities. So if they ignore those social costs, their supply curve is going to not include those external costs, and it's going to lead to overproduction. And what we're going to look at in the next graph is how we can see that overproduction on the supply and demand graph for this particular chemical company, and that how we can use the government to actually limit the production and incentivize companies to take into account the cost of their pollution. Okay, so here's how we're going to do it. This is the graph of a market for cigarettes. This is the graph of a negative externality. So when we draw negative externalities, here's a shorthand on how to think about this. If we're drawing a negative externality, there are extra costs. Therefore, there are 2 supply curves because there's more costs paid by people outside of the market. Okay, so what are we looking at right here? We have a regular demand curve, which is showing the marginal social benefit because all people who are benefiting from smoking cigarettes are accounted for by our demand curve. However, if we look at our supply curve, it's only showing the marginal private cost, and those are the costs incurred by the firms participating in that market. Okay, if we took into account the social cost, in other words, the externalities, the negative externalities paid by folks outside of the production of cigarettes, then we would have a second supply curve. So the marginal social cost is higher than the marginal private cost because there are external costs that the firms participating in the market are not taking into account. What do we see here? Well, we can see there's 2 different quantities. This is the quantity that the free market provided. However, if we took into account all the costs, you can see that the marginal social benefit would actually equal the marginal social cost here. So there's a socially optimum quantity, which is less than the free market quantity. How do we know that the free market quantity is not what society wants? It's because at the free market quantity, which is shown right here, the marginal social costs are greater than the marginal social benefit. And that actually lets us see that because there's that gap there, there's dead weight loss that's existing in the unregulated market. So the free market is failing because there's dead weight loss that exists with no intervention by the government. We can see that the quantity provided by the free market is greater than the quantity that's socially optimal. So there's an over allocation of resources in this market. We have too many cigarettes being produced. And because, again, the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social, because the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal social benefit, we have dead weight loss created. Now, What's a trick to remember this particular deadweight loss? It looks like an arrow that's saying, hey, we want less produced in this market. It's pointing to the socially optimum outcome. And it's the deadweight loss is a triangle that is pointing to the socially optimum output. And the way that you find the side of that triangle is you go to the quantity free market, and then you, at the quantity free market, you find your marginal social cost. And then in this case, the gap between your marginal social cost and your marginal social benefit. And that's how you would draw the deadweight loss triangle. So next question is, how do we fix it? The answer is tax it. So we want the government to put a per unit tax on the production of cigarettes here that is equal to the externality. If we do that properly, we're going to shift the marginal private cost curve up so that the marginal private cost curve with the tax is equal to the marginal social cost curve. And if that's the case, the firms would then produce less, and that our socially optimum output would be achieved by adding a tax. So this is different than the analysis we've done before, because adding the tax when there's a negative externality eliminated the deadweight loss. And that's different than a normal market when there's no externalities. By adding a tax, the government was creating deadweight loss. Okay? In this case, we corrected the market failure through government intervention. Next up, we have positive externalities. So in addition to negative externalities, there are positive externalities. Positive externalities are spillover benefits to society. When there are positive externalities, people outside of that transaction are benefiting. Great examples of this are flu vaccines, education, and home renovation. Let's analyze an individual family's decision to get a flu vaccine. Let's say a mom is deciding if she's going to get a flu vaccine for her child. We're going to assume, as a self-interested rational actor, she's only looking at internal benefits. How much is her kid going to benefit by being protected from the flu versus what is the cost in terms of, not only explicit cost, but implicit cost of taking the time to go get him or her vaccinated. She's not going to think about the social benefits of a healthier society with widespread vaccination. So her private demand curve is going to be her marginal benefit curve is going to be her demand curve, but she's not going to take into account the external benefits. So what could we do? Well, we could have the government recognize this positive externality, and we could have the government subsidize in order to increase the quantity and get it out to the socially optimum quantity. So what does this actually look like? Let's imagine this is the market for flu shots. We have a supply and a demand curve. This time, it's going to be a little bit different. The supply curve we're looking at here is the marginal social cost curve, because all costs of production are incurred by the firms who are producing vaccines. This time, our demand curve is a little bit different. It's showing the marginal private benefit that is enjoyed by the consumers who are choosing to participate in that market. And then we're going to get an equilibrium quantity at the free market there. However, if we took into account all of the external benefits that other members of society were getting, we would have a second demand curve showing the marginal social benefit, which includes those benefits to people outside of the market. Why is this a market failure? Well, take a look. At the quantity free market, our marginal social cost is only down here. However, our marginal social benefit is way up here. So because at the quantity free market, the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost, we can see the market's failing, and we're going to have dead weight loss existing when the market is unregulated and unsubsidized. So there's an underallocation of society's resources equal to that distance there. And just like last time, we can see at the quantity free market, if we drew a line connecting the gap between our MSB and our MSC, then we would easily figure out how to draw our dead weight loss triangle. And the way I think about this is we have an arrow where society is saying, we want more flu shots, but the free market is not providing it. So what do we do as policymakers? We subsidize, okay? And in order to do that, we're going to pay a per unit subsidy that's equal to the amount of the externality. And if we did that, it would shift our marginal private benefit curve to the right until the marginal private benefit curve with the subsidy is equal to the marginal social benefit curve. At that point, we could be producing the socially optimum output of vaccines and correct this market failure. Okay, so to kind of summarize that, when there was a positive externality, there were two demand curves, and we added a subsidy in order to fix it. Whereas when there was a negative externality, there were two supply curves, and we added a tax in order to fix it. Either way, the government can fix this market failure by intervening and eliminating the dead weight loss. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.